Hey everyone, in this video what we're going to do is start to set up the core components, the foundational components, to be able to manage our Azure DevOps and GitHub platforms completely using Terraform. As we've talked about before, using Terraform to manage our GitHub platforms just makes things tremendously easier. It gives us one place where we can manage all the configurations and the management of the platforms. It allows us to do this in an automated and in a workflow process, and also allows us to do it at scale. Using Terraform and the out-of-box providers that Microsoft uses as part of Azure DevOps and GitHub just allows us to be able to use Terraform to be able to manage this all using code. So as we talk about these platforms and how we get this set up, if once we're in the run model and we're adding things into code and managing things, it works beautifully. But to be able to set this up from scratch, we got to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere and set up the components, get those imported into Terraform using the import capability, and then we can start to add components over time, and it's so much easier to manage. However, you got to start somewhere. So where we start typically is using our DevOps configuration. Our TF DevOps configuration is the core configuration that we're going to use to add the initial components and start to build out over time. So how we manage core Azure DevOps, managing core GitHub, using Terraform to manage Terraform, and then all the other specific configurations that we'll add over time, which will all be product centric. So as we'll go along, we'll start to talk about how we organize the various components into product-centric configurations as the business looks at as products, managing products that the business owns. We can then start to organize our DevOps platform in the same way, grouping those as products. So what we're going to do in today's video is we're going to manage and run with how to set up that initial configuration inside of Terraform and get some of those core components set up within Azure DevOps. So let's jump in. So if we look at Terraform, this is a fresh project that's set up inside of Terraform. In a previous video, we set up the VCS provider so that we now have a connection back into Azure DevOps. So if you haven't followed along with that video, we'll put a link down into the comments so that you can follow along and make sure that you have your VCS provider set up with a service account that has access to the various code repositories that we're going to need. So we're inside of Terraform. The first thing that we are going to do is we're going to modify the default project, because just like anything else, we want to be able to test things in a dev test prod scenario. Now I'm going to remove the test, and what I typically do is I just have a dev and a prod, because we don't necessarily do a ton of things that warrants a whole lot of testing. So what I've done in the past is we set up is just a dev environment. So that means it's going to allow us to have a dev Azure DevOps, and it's going to allow us to have a dev GitHub so that we can test all the core components. So while we could do that in the same organizations or projects within the platforms, it just allows us to have a completely set off area where we can test all of our configurations, test the deployments of GitHub or of Terraform itself, and just allows us to do that in one place. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the settings of the default project. And what I like to do is make this actually our prod. Now I'm calling this DevOps prod because this is how Terraform is going to manage everything to do with DevOps. So if you have other teams that are using Terraform within the same project, then what I would suspect is you would start to see a dev prod and other projects that are in there as well. So this just allows us to encapsulate everything that we're doing around DevOps platforming inside of this specific area. And then using Terraform, you can control all of the permissions. So let's say you have a SecOps group, or you have your infrastructure group that is also managing various projects inside of Terraform. So here we have our org for Make Solutions, and then we have all the various workspaces, and then we can group those workspaces into projects. So what I like to do is have two projects here. One of them is going to be called if we go back out here and go into the settings, we're going to call this DevOps prod. And I usually change the default one because you can't delete the default. And so this project is the default, it cannot be deleted. So I typically name DevOps prod to be the default just to make sure that it can't be deleted. Now, there's always protections of not deleting the production workspace and project, but I just like to rename this one just to make sure. So now what we're going to have is our DevOps prod. So if we go back out into our Make Solutions org, we now have a DevOps prod project, and that's exactly what we need. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another project, DevOps non-prod. So now what we're going to do, again, we have to start somewhere, is we're going to get to the point where we can create one singular config that is a link to a code repository within Azure DevOps, and then that is going to feed directly into both our prod and our non-prod using the proper variables. So we don't have to move things around branches, we don't have to have separate code repositories. We're going to have one repo that we can now deploy to both a prod and a non-prod using Terraform. It's going to work very, very nicely. So now that we have these two areas, again, we have to start somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our first workspace. Now before we do that, we need to have a code repository that this workspace talks to. So I'm going to jump back into Azure DevOps, and I'm going to go into our code. So you'll see this is a vanilla environment. I just have the out-of-box home repo, and I'm going to create a new repo, and I'm going to call this TF DevOps. I like to put TF dash in front of the names because then I know exactly that these are Terraform configuration specific code repositories. And I do everything typically lowercase just because it's easier to manage. So we'll add a README. We'll talk about modifying READMEs a little bit later. And then for the git ignore, Terraform does have a specific git ignore that you can use. So it's just going to ignore a lot of those files that we don't necessarily need in source control specifically for Terraform. It's already loaded into Azure DevOps for us. That is great. And I'll add that git ignore and create. So now this is just a base repo. There's nothing in here, and we're going to start to populate with these with files. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my DevOps prod workspace and, into my project. We're going to go into version control. And here is that VCS provider that we had set up in the previous video. And now I'm going to see our TF DevOps repo. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to select that. I'm not going to make any changes. And now we can see that what we want this to do is it's going to be a branched-based trigger. So anything that gets triggered and set automatically into main, that's how we know that this is how it's going to do its applies. And then we're going to use the power of pull requests to be able to validate those changes before they actually go. So we're going to set this and go ahead and create our workspace. Now at the same time, since we have to start somewhere and we want to talk to prod and non-prod, we have to do the same for our non-prod. And we're going to point at the same repository. Again, the variables is what's going to be the difference that manages what exactly is prod and non-prod. So if I go back to Make Solutions, here's my TF DevOps for this workspace. That's exactly what I want. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to create a workspace for non-prod, again version controlled against this VCS provider. I'm going to talk to the TF DevOps, and what I did in the other one, and I'm going to change the name here, is actually this needs to be DevOps-NP. We'll go back to the other one and change the name. The reason is TF DevOps is going to be the names of our repos. So we're always going to do TF dash, and those are the names of the repos. But we don't want TF on these names because we don't necessarily need that as part of those names. But I am going to add -NP because now I know this specifically is a non-prod workspace. So again, we have to start somewhere. So we're creating this manually, and eventually we're going to get this back inside of Terraform managing it as well. So I'm going to go back into this, and I'm going to change this project around, and we just want to change this name, and we're just going to call this DevOps. That's actually the name that we want. All right, so now if we go back out here, now if we look at all workspaces, we now have pointing to the same repository into tf-devops. I can even shrink this a little bit. tf-devops, we have both of these. One is a non-prod, the other is a prod, all based off of the project settings. Again, further in the videos, we're going to talk about how we lock these down, where we can give developers a little bit more access in terms of the non-prod workspaces, and then we can allow and control a little bit more of the production workspaces of which changes can be made and when. So this is exactly what we want this to look like. So the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to get this cloned down in Visual Studio so that in future videos we can start to make changes to these configurations, start importing them into state, and we'll talk about what exactly state is, and then get those automatically applying as we're supposed to as part of our workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open Visual Studio. I'm actually going to clone this. We're going to hit clone. This is the repo that we want. Wrong button. So we're going to clone this in VS Code. Yes. And that's going to open VS Code. It's going to ask me where I want to pop this. I have a specific directory that I like to use. We'll go repo home. And now let me bring this down into our window here so you can see what's going on there. So this is going to clone this down into our repository, and it's going to clone it locally down onto my local machine. That's what it's doing right now, and it's going to allow us to make those changes. And then the last thing I want to do once this gets cloned down, so now it wants to know, who are you? This is me. So we're going to do that. I like to add things to workspaces. I think working in workspaces inside of Visual Studio is wonderful. Just allows you to group all of those repositories in one place, and now I have this here. So now what we're going to do in our next video is we're going to start to populate some of these configurations and talk about the core components. And the first thing that we're going to do is, as you know, we have our singular home project. We're going to get this home project imported into state so we can see exactly what that looks like. So this is kind of the beginnings of managing DevOps platforms inside of Terraform. We're going to start to add more to this over time. Would love to hear your comments. Are you managing Azure DevOps and GitHub using Terraform? What have you found has been successful, unsuccessful? Are you using a prod and a non-prod? Is that working? What's the pros and the cons that you've seen as part of that? So if this video has been helpful, go ahead and give us a like. Follow us at our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear more as you kind of join us in this journey of making DevOps better and automating all these pieces so that we can build software better over time. So thanks for joining, and we'll see you in the next video.